Executive Director for Lane County Historical Society. This is, as we, I think, announced a few minutes ago, the second of our history pubs this particular season. So we're fairly new at this, so thank you for bearing with us. I do want to suggest something about my own museum, and that's that today an important first step towards reopening took place. A week ago, we installed 2 brand new ductless heat pumps, and today the air scrubber filters were put on, and they tell us that the scrubber filters will take care of mold, which has been a problem before in our building, and also COVID-19, so that we have just improved the air circulation in a building where the air circulation was not so good. And that's one of the reasons why we're not quite open yet. But this was a very important first step towards reopening the museum. And I wanted everyone to at least know about that and how excited, that our staff is about this first step. Okay, the next thing is that we're going to do an ad, or at least a bit of an ad, for Viking Braggot. And unfortunately, I'm convalescing at the moment, and I'm forbidden to have alcohol, or I would normally be here with a beer stein. I happen to like Viking Braggot's Imperial Stout. And last time we did this, last month, I departed from my normal hamburger, which any one of their burger choices are quite excellent at Viking Braggot Southtown. But I departed and got bangers and mash, which I've had over in Britain. This was not British bangers and mash. This was better. This was good. So if you want to depart from the burger menu and have that opportunity, I recommend the bangers and mash. It's always my pleasure to introduce the other History Pub co-host, Dr. Marcia Weiziger from the UO History Department. But before I do that, I want to take a chance and kind of recommend a book to people. It's called Thunder in the Mountains. And the author is Daniel Sharfstein. He's a prof actually at Vanderbilt, a history prof. And basically it's a very interesting depiction of Oliver Otis Howard and Chief Joseph during the Nez Perce War, but goes into both before and after. And of course, one of my favorite characters, one of the oddballs of Oregon history, and that's Charles Erskine Scott Wood, who recorded Chief Joseph's words, I will fight no more forever, that famous piece. Sharfstein it's very readable. It's not short, but he's not one of the historians that'll put you to sleep either. And I thought terribly appropriate on Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly Columbus Day, to recommend a book to our audience. So with that, Marcia, please take it away and let's introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. As he said, I'm Marcia Weiziger. I am a professor in the Department of History at the University of Oregon, and we co-sponsor this event most months in at least during the academic year, and we've done some in the summers as well. So we welcome you, and particularly welcome you because it is Indigenous Peoples Day, so we should commemorate Indigenous Peoples Day, at least by the very least acknowledging that the University of Oregon sits on unceded land that was the land of the Kalapuya people, and they are still alive and well today. I've just been, yesterday visited the Talking Stones, which is an installation in Alton Baker Park. If you ever want to go and learn some Kalapuya words, it's really interesting. But so now that I've acknowledged Indigenous Peoples Day and the Kalapuya, I'd like to introduce to you all our speaker today, who is someone I have known for quite a long time. I think maybe at least 30 years, perhaps. Sherry actually gave me the confidence to go back and get my PhD. She may not realize that, but we met right before I was accepted in my PhD program, very nervous about it. And she was so encouraging, and I really appreciated that on her part. She is a professor emerita from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Before that, she was a professor at the University of Texas, El Paso. I think she might have been there when I met her. And she has written a number of great books. The book we're going to be hearing about today is Bohemians West. But prior to that, she has written, given that it's Indigenous Peoples Day, some very appropriate books for that occasion. Her last one is one of my favorites, Hippies, Indians, and the Fight for Red Power. Before that, and that's a really fabulous book, I have to say. I've used it in the classroom. Students loved it. She's also written Reimagining Indians, Native Americans Through Anglo Eyes, 1880 to 1940. The Sagebrush Soldier, Private William Earl Smith's View of the Sioux War of 1876. And I think this might have been her first book, The View from Officers Row, Army Perceptions of Western Indians. And then she's also done some edited collections and a lot of things, great things that she did at Southern Methodist University, where she was one of the co-directors of the Clement Center for Southwest Studies. And I got to spend a year with her one time, so it was delightful. Anyway, so enough said about all of Sherry's. Oh, and I should also say, she is a former president of the Western History Association and gave one of the best talks about how we should think about our relationships with Indigenous people as her presidential address that I highly recommend, an essay written in the Western History Quarterly. Anyway, so without any more ado, I'd like to introduce to you Sherry Smith, and I'm going to get the slides up for her. Let's see here. This is always tricky, how to do this. Start. Hold on. Got to share my screen first. Okay, and Sherry, you'll just have to tell me when to shift. And be sure to unmute your, unmute your, Sherry, you're muted. You need to unmute your microphone.
All right, there we go.
Sure.
Sorry, everybody. We've had some issues, and I think we're having a big windstorm here in Wyoming. That may be the problem. I don't know. But anyway, I'm really pleased to be here. I hope you can hear me. I, of course, love Marcia. You cannot hear me?
We can.
You can.
Yeah. Yes.
Great. Perfect. Okay. Marcia, I'm so appreciative of the invitation, and it's great to see you on the screen at least. I also want to thank the University of Oregon History Department and the Lane County History Museum, the Lane County Cultural Coalition, all of you wonderful people in Eugene for being willing to go virtual with me tonight and put up with some of the technical difficulties we've had so far. So I want to talk to you about my new book called Bohemians West, Free Love, Family and Radicals in the 20th Century. And the heart of the book is actually the free love relationship between this man on your screen, that's Charles Erskine Scott Wood, and I will eventually ask you to move on to the next screen, but not quite yet, but Sarah Bartfield. And one of the reviewers for this manuscript said that these are two of the most interesting people you have never heard of. And I had to kind of laugh at that because I think, frankly, that's mostly true, except in Oregon. In Oregon, that's at least one place where people know about Charles Erskine Scott Wood. And as Bob indicated, it is partly because of his involvement in the Nez Perce War and the fact that he befriended Chief Joseph. And as he recorded the speech, I do believe that those were words that probably Wood said, that Chief Joseph said to Wood, at least some of them were things he said to him. But I also believe that Wood added some poetic flourishes to that surrender speech. He also lived many years in Portland, where he was a fairly significant legal and cultural figure, and he was also a literary figure associated with the Pacific Northwest. So the picture on the left is Wood as an Army officer in 1877. It's one of my favorite pictures of him. I think he looks pretty handsome in that photograph. The attitude, there's just something about the attitude I also like. Some people don't like it, but I do sort of like his attitude in that picture. And he was probably about 25 years old, maybe 26 when that photo was taken. The one on the right is him in 1918 when he was getting to be close to, he was in his 60s actually. So when he met Sarah Bartfield, he looked more like the guy on the right than the guy on the left, but still quite a handsome man. The next slide shows Sarah Bartfield, 2 stages in her life. So Sarah is not nearly as well known as Erskine anywhere, including Oregon. But if she is known anywhere, it is in the suffrage circles. She made a name for herself in her 20s in the suffrage movement. But she is not one of the better known ones. And to my dismay, this year there was this wonderful jigsaw puzzle. I don't know if anybody saw it, but it was a jigsaw puzzle of famous suffragists. And I think there were 50 of them in the jigsaw puzzle, but Sarah did not make it. She did not make the cut. But when she is known by historians, it's in the context of the women's suffrage movement. The picture on the left is one of her about the time when she first met Wood. She describes herself as in her inscription as looking like a librarian. She is really quite buttoned up, and her hair is all on top of her head, and she's got those glasses, and she looks pretty prim. The photograph on the right is taken a few years later after she has left her husband and is in a full-blown love affair with Charles Erskine Scott Wood. And I just think the demeanor and everything about that picture is really quite different. And you can see her, she's moved into the Bohemian world in the photograph on the right. So, why write a book about somebody that hardly anybody except the good people of Oregon have heard of? And the answer is because they are interesting. They're fascinating people who lived full and rich lives, full kinds of drama and trauma and passion, and they wrote all about it, and they had lots to say to each other and to us, frankly, about the world in which they lived. And so when I began dipping into their letters, I could not stop. And I wasn't.
Sherry, you're frozen.
Are we back?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I don't know why this keeps popping off. But anyway, I found others were interested as well when I began telling people about this story. It's a different kind of book for me. I have been an academic historian, but I wanted to do something different, and I wanted to write a narrative history. And so that's what this is. It is a biography, a dual biography, a biography of a relationship that is steeped in a whole lot of scholarly research. But it is written as a story, and it's meant for the so-called general reader. I hope academics will like it too, but I really wanted to write something that would capture the attention of a broader readership. So what I'm not doing in this book is to use scholarly language. I'm not making a historiographical intervention. I have no big new argument or thesis to make about free love or about radicals in America, these title notwithstanding. But instead, what I wanted to do in this book was to provide some insight into the lived experience of the era in which these two people lived. And these are two people who lived on the edge. First of all, they lived on the edge of the continent. They met in Portland and they ultimately lived in California. But they saw themselves, and I believe it's true, they were in fact cultural bohemians. They were advocates and livers of free love. They were also political radicals. And we normally associate that combination with the other end of the country, with Greenwich Village in New York City. So I wanted to make the point that there were people like that everywhere, including in Portland, Oregon, as well as California. So they lived on the edge of the continent, but they also were living on the edge of experimentation regarding marriage and relationships between men and women, and looking for other ways to create a life of love that was outside those traditional boundaries of marriage. And they also traveled very thickly into the edge of radical politics in this country. So I wanted to present them as, I wanted to tell their personal story. I wanted to tell an individual story. I wanted to tell the story on a granular scale, rather than the broad panorama, which historians are supposed to be going for most of the time. I wanted to look at how these two human beings negotiated their effort to carve out a radical new way of life. And thankfully for me, they provided an abundance of evidence. They wrote over 2,700 letters to each other, most of which are at the Huntington Library. Others are at the Bancroft. There are some at the Lewis and Clark College in Portland Library, but not between the two of them, but family letters there. And the University of Oregon Special Collection has a great collection of Sarah's sister's papers, where I found some wonderful material as well. But over 2,700 letters just between the two of them. And then there are letters they wrote to their spouses, letters they wrote to the other person's spouses, letters they wrote to their children, letters their children wrote to them, siblings, parents, and then all the famous people, political and literary people that they knew as well. So there was just an abundance of material here to dive into. And I just really decided that the only way to do this story justice was to try to write a biography of the two of them. I think in the end, it makes this history more human, comprehensible, and yes, I think more interesting. Now, the other reason for writing the book is that their story seems so incredibly contemporary to me. The choices that they had to make, the challenges and the dilemmas that they faced. First, family, relationships of power between men and women, the responsibilities of parents to their children, but also to themselves, how to calibrate where you emphasize self-sacrifice for children and when you pull back from that and put more emphasis on self-realization. These were the kinds of issues that they were dealing with, and that people, I think, today still continue to be perplexed by. And then there are, again, the larger political issues that Erskine and Sarah devoted a good deal of time and treasure to. The inequalities in the larger political and economic sphere, the ongoing assaults of civil liberties and human rights, the conflicts between workers and big business, corporate power, and the corruption with federal government, with presidents, and so on, and the profound inequality between the super rich and the rest of us. And then finally, they were fiercely anti-imperialist, and they fought long and hard against imperialism in the context of the Indian Wars for wood, and eventually World War I for both of them. So in many ways, their world seemed remarkably familiar, and again, I thought worth talking about today. So tonight, I just want to do a slice of this because there's actually a lot in the book. It starts with Wood's birth in 1852, and it ends with her death in 1974. And so that's a pretty big sort of, arc in terms of time. And there's also not only the personal relationship and their political involvement, but also the poetry that they wrote, which was very important to them. And then the interesting relationships they had with very famous people, both literary and political. So there's a lot in the book. But tonight, I only have a few minutes, and so I want to focus on one particular thing, and that is to talk about the way in which the personal and the political became very intertwined in the relationship between Erskine and Sarah, and in particular, how Sarah's involvement in the suffrage movement really shaped that love affair. So I haven't been lecturing, so I don't have a big, strong voice for this. Let me say a few words about who they were when they met, and a little bit about their relationship, and then I'll move into suffrage, and then I'll return to the relationship itself. Wood was an Army officer, a very reluctant one. His father made him go to West Point, and he was never hugely interested in the military, and he got out of it as soon as he could, but not until he, thanks to O.O. Howard's mentorship, was able to go to law school and get a legal degree. And at that point in the 1880s, he returned to Portland. He was born in the East, but he loved the Northwest from his Army career, and he returned to Portland with his family and had a very successful political career, legal career there. Sarah Bartfield was the wife of a Baptist minister. She was also the daughter of a very fervent Baptist man. And so she was raised in that religious context. But she had an older sister, Mary Field, who was somewhat of a rebel. And Mary went off to the University of Michigan and began to think more broadly, and she would come home and she began to challenge their father. And Sarah was listening to all of this. And even then, a teenager was beginning to have some doubts about the world in which she had grown up. But her father, upset with her sister, would not allow Sarah to go to the University of Michigan, which had been her dream. So her form of rebellion was to marry this Baptist minister who came to visit her parents when she was right out of high school. And so she married him and ended up eventually in Cleveland, Ohio, where her political instincts, which were progressive liberal, became very important to her. She was a good friend of the famous progressive mayor of Cleveland, Tom Johnson. And both Sarah and her husband, the Reverend Erskine, were self-defined Christian socialists. And because of their political activism, actually, Erskine lost his church in Cleveland, and his next church was out in Portland. So that sets the scene, how Sarah and Wood were in the same place in Portland in 1910. She was not really crazy about going to Oregon. She thought it was the end of the earth. She didn't know what she was going to do there. But the very famous lawyer, Clarence Darrow, who she knew because her sister Mary was involved in a love affair with Clarence Darrow, told Sarah, don't worry. When you get to Oregon, when you get to Portland, there's a very interesting man, and I want you to look him up. I think you will like him. Well, Sarah did not look him up, but when Clarence Darrow came to town, he made sure that Sarah and Charles Erskine Scott Wood met for dinner. He sat them next to each other, and that was the beginning of what became a very important affair to both of them. Now, on this evening when they met, 30 years in age separated them. Sarah was 28, Erskine was 58. Social class separated them. He was, of the wealthy class of Portland, and she was, a sort of poverty-stricken minister's wife. Educational background. He was a West Point educated officer, and then he went to Columbia Law School. Sarah had a high school education. Religious orientation. She was still a Baptist at this moment, and Wood was a self-described atheist. But they also shared much. They shared political values and views. Wood was a self-described philosophical anarchist, but he was also a pragmatist and was involved in progressive politics in Portland. Sarah, as I said, was a Christian socialist. They shared a love of literature and poetry, which became apparent the first night that they met. They shared childhoods with tyrannical fathers who dismissed their children's yearnings and ambitions. They shared dissatisfaction with their marriages. They shared a sexual attraction toward one another. And eventually they shared a belief that free love was preferable to traditional marriage. By this time, Wood had already and totally embraced that and went on record in his public essays advocating free love as preferable to marriage. Sarah hadn't thought a great deal of it, I don't think, at this time, but she quickly became a convert to that herself. And finally, they shared a deep desire to be their true selves and to realize their greatest potential as poets, and to do so in relationship with one another. It was poetry that brought them together initially. And it was sadly Reverend Ergot who was responsible for bringing them together a second time. He loved Sarah very much. He also knew she was unhappy, and he was trying to find something in Portland, besides being his wife and the minister's wife in the church, that would bring her satisfaction. So he knew she had great respect for Wood from this first meeting, and he also knew that Wood was trying to be a poet. So he suggested to Wood that Wood hire Sarah to be an editor, to help him go through his chest full of poetry that he'd been writing over the years, that he'd just thrown into the chest. And he thought that Sarah could help him, edit his work and find some of it that might be publishable. So that's how they actually got together. And it didn't take very long for Sarah to fall in love with Wood, and he, of course, was attracted to her. The relationship was consummated in the summer of 1911. And from that point on, Sarah knew she had to leave her marriage, and she didn't know how she was going to do it, but she hoped she could do it in a way that would allow her to retain custody of her children. And she also wanted to do it as soon as possible. And the one thing that was absolutely certain was from that point forward, her primary goal in life was to live with Charles Erskine Scott Wood. And she wanted him to drop everything and join her immediately. Well, Wood encouraged her freedom. He encouraged her to develop her gifts and to establish a new life. He certainly enjoyed having her as a partner, but he was not in a rush to commit to her or to leave his law firm or to leave his family in Portland. He was married to a woman who was closer to his age. They had 5 grown children who were beginning families of their own by this time. His wife knew about the string of affairs that Erskine had already had. She was Catholic. She refused to divorce him. And I think she was hoping that eventually he would outgrow this and come back to her, and they would live the rest of their lives together. But he certainly made clear to Sarah very early on that she should not necessarily assume that they would last in a relationship. And he also made it clear that he could not simply drop everything and run off with her. In particular, he was waiting for a windfall that would come from a long drawn-out legal case that in time would allow him to retire and provide generous trust funds to his wife and to all of his grown children. Patriarchal responsibility for their economic well-being was paramount to him, and he was not going to leave Portland for anybody until he was able to accomplish that. Yet, he also felt deep frustration over never having been able to be the man he truly was. He was a soldier for his father. He was a lawyer for his wife and his children. But now, as he was nearing 60, he wanted for the rest of his life to pursue a life of poetry and to do so in a free love relationship with a woman. And he thought that Sarah was probably the best one for that. Now, what did they mean by free love? It meant individual freedom to love, unfettered by promises that were overseen or enforced by either church or state. Love did not require sanction from any institution. In fact, quite the opposite was the ideal. And it also meant freedom to leave when love ended, cleanly and clearly, again, without any intrusion of church or state in the ending of that relationship. Sarah came to accept this definition of free love, to embrace it actually, and neither wanted to ever marry again. But they did differ on a couple of things. The first one I've already mentioned is the issue of timing. When would they actually live together? And it was 7 years between the time they first became lovers and the time when Wood finally did leave Portland and join her in California. So they were separated for much of this time. It certainly produced a rich trove of letters, but it also made it clear that this issue never went away. Sarah was always wanting him to come, and he was always putting her off. A second issue was the question of the level of sacrifice each was willing to make. Without any doubt, Sarah had much more to lose than Erskine did. This is a woman leaving her minister husband for a known radical and rake. She was embracing free love in 1911. This was also quite unusual for a middle-class woman of Sarah's background. But she was willing to leap off. She threw her reputation to the wind. She didn't care about that. She leaped off, not knowing what was going to happen, if Wood would catch her or if she would be able to support herself. And she also was really risking the loss of her children, and she knew that. And in fact, once the divorce is finalized, she did lose custody of the children. And through all of this, Wood seemed also, again, to not be moving any closer to coming to her. So she was reminding him of his sacrifices and pushing him to come and join her and live the dream he had always had. But he was resisting for all these years and resenting the pressure she was putting on him. A third source of tension was the issue of monogamy. Some people, when they hear free love, think it means promiscuity. That isn't really what either Erskine or Sarah had in mind. But she did hope that in their relationship that he would remain faithful to her. And this was not going to happen. And he did not promise it. And they had many very interesting discussions in their letters back and forth about this. She clearly hoped that she would be the one and only for him. When she was gone for long periods of time from Portland, he almost always had another woman besides his wife that he was involved with. From Wood's point of view, monogamy was antithetical to nature. And he thought it was especially antithetical to men's nature. He thought women might be, find that easier, but he did not think men were naturally monogamous. And so this was an issue between the two of them until they finally did live together in California. And at that point, that issue evaporated. It is also by this time, Wood is about 68 years old, and that could have been a factor too. I don't know. Then finally, I think the final area of tension, but one really envelops all of these others, is the issue of power. Who exercised the power in this relationship and why? Well, clearly in the early years, Erskine had the upper hand. He was older, he was more experienced, he presumably had more wisdom, and frankly, he had money. And I don't mean to suggest that he was using money to get his will and get his way, but nevertheless, money does play something of a factor, I think, in power relationships. So this is the context then in which Sarah turns to the suffrage movement. So she has this love affair, this man that she believes is her purpose in life is to live with him, to help him produce poetry for the ages and maybe write a little bit of her own. But she has to wait for him to disengage from Portland. And she also has to find for herself some kind of way to make a living. He was supporting her. He was providing her with housing in San Francisco where she ends up living, food, of course, and also all the costs of the divorce. He was covering all that. She didn't feel good about that. She was a feminist who really did want to be self-supporting. So it is the suffrage movement where Sarah begins to grow. And she discovers that, in fact, she can earn an independent living working in the suffrage movement. She can do something meaningful in the company of wonderful, daring women who become deep friends of hers. And it also provides her with a really important distraction from what is, frankly, an obsession with Charles Erskine Scott Wood. So beyond the personal context, there's also the geographical or regional context that I want to point out. She joins the suffrage movement in the American West. And so her engagement in suffrage helps us understand that there is a Western angle to the suffrage movement that is important to understand when we look at the bigger picture of the national suffrage movement of the 20th century. So as I know Marcia knows, and perhaps many of your listeners know as well, in the initial stages, the suffrage movement was taking place on a state-by-state level. And the first place where Sarah actually gets experience in the suffrage movement was in Oregon. And it was actually before she left her husband. She was involved with Wood, but trying to keep it secret. In 1912, she was doing two things. She was looking for a way out of her marriage. She was also looking for a way to prove to herself that she had the capabilities to support herself if need be. Well, she had a really wonderful friend who recruited her to help with the 1912 suffrage campaign in Oregon. And so Sarah went out all around the state and met people in their homes, in their churches, or on street corners when she would climb up on an automobile and give a stump speech about suffrage. And she was really good at it. She went all over the place, and she actually delighted in the experience of not only meeting people, but winning many of them over to her side. She was quite attractive. She was kind of small and thin. I can't remember if it was in Bend or Pendleton, or one of those places where the local newspaper's headline about her was "Suffragist is not fat." So she was just had the right look and the demeanor and her excellent oratory skills to really shine in this context. Now, Erskine was an advocate of women's suffrage. He was also, as I said, a pragmatic politician. And so in the fall of 1912, he was on the hustings to support Woodrow Wilson's campaign for the presidency. So the two of them were out around the state, traveling on sort of parallel rails for their parallel political purposes. It also allowed them to occasionally have rendezvous along the way and have a highly romantic and wonderful time of it. So she really loved the experience of the suffrage campaign. The suffrage won. The men of Oregon decided to support women's suffrage. Finally, I think it was the third or fourth time. President Wilson, or Woodrow Wilson, also won the presidency. So they were both happy with the outcome of the election. But I think most importantly for Sarah, she grew in confidence in her abilities as a speaker, as an ardent advocate of a political issue, and in her determination to leave her marriage. In fact, while she was out in Eastern Oregon, she wrote a letter to her husband telling him that she did intend to leave him. And by the end of that year, she did finally extricate herself from the marriage by going down to California, where she stayed from that point forward. It took a couple of years to work through the whole process of divorce and so forth. And as I already indicated, it was at the cost of losing custody of her children, which was very heartbreaking for her. Her next suffrage experience came in 1915 with the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco. By this time, she had gotten to know some of the women who were working with Alice Paul. And the Alice Paul and the Congressional Union, soon to become the National Women's Party, decided to put up a booth at the Panama Pacific Exposition. And their purpose there was to gain attention for the idea that what we really needed in this country was a federal amendment to the Constitution. Enough with this piecemeal state-by-state stuff. But at this point, the West had actually settled the enfranchised women, but the rest of the country was far behind. And so to expedite the whole women's suffrage process, a federal amendment was seen as the way to go. So they had a booth where they put up this big piece of parchment paper upon which they were asking particularly the women voters of California and other Western states to sign the petition demanding a federal amendment, but men could also vote as well. But they especially wanted to make it clear that there are women voters now who had political power, and they intended to use it to push the government to enfranchise all women. So by the end of this petition was supposed to be something like 4 miles long. It was a huge petition. And Alice Paul, famous head of the National Women's Party, decided, and now I'm ready to go on finally to the next slide, that Sarah Bartfield and another suffragist named Frances Jolliffe and 2 Swedes who lived in the United States and had purchased a car in California should drive this petition across the continent to Washington, D.C. So Marcia, can you get the next photograph going?
Yes.
Okay. So this is an incredible thing to suggest in 1915. To drive a car across the continent is just an incredible feat for anybody at this particular point in history. There's no interstate highways, there's no Rand McNally atlases, but more than that, many people didn't think women were able to drive across the street, let alone across the country. So this was meant to be a statement that women could drive cars, they could drive across the country, they had power, and they were going to translate that power into political power as well. So here are 3 of the 4. Frances Jolliffe peeled back. She peeled out of it by the time they got to Sacramento. So it was really Sarah and these two women who drove the vehicle across the country. Along the way, they would stop and give speeches about suffrage and gather additional signatures from people. They actually did make it. They got a little help along the way. They put the boat on, I think, Lake Erie. I mean, the car on the boat in Lake Erie and so forth. But this was a huge national story. Wherever they went, they got amazing attention. And they did, in fact, get to Washington, D.C. Sarah, they went up to the Capitol in the car. Sarah went up, met congressmen, and went on to the White House and met President Wilson. She became a national figure, not overnight, because it took a couple months for this to work itself out. But it brought tremendous attention to the movement for a federal amendment, but also tremendous attention to Sarah Bartfield. She became a media celebrity. She also brought with her these exceptional skills as a fundraiser and an orator. And Alice Paul wanted her to stay in the East, but she did not have any interest in staying in the East. She wanted to go back to the West because that is where Erskine lived. So she's still waiting for him to come and join her in California. And then in 1916, she becomes even more involved in the National Women's Party and a huge advocate of their essential strategy, which was to use Western women voting power to punish candidates who would not support the federal amendment. Or the other way to say this is to support any candidate for office who was in favor of the federal amendment. In other words, make the federal amendment, women's suffrage, the key issue upon which their vote rested. So this is like the one issue concept of voting. And so they were pushing this very hard. It didn't matter what the person's party was. Those advocates of the federal amendment were going to get their vote, and those who opposed it would not. Well, that meant Woodrow Wilson, who was a Southern Democrat and not willing to push his party to support an amendment, was going to be the opposition. And the National Women's Party was going to be opposed to Woodrow Wilson. Sarah, as a consequence, was opposed to Woodrow Wilson's reelection as well. She was hired by the National Women's Party to travel through Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming to try to convince women voters and men voters as well to vote against Woodrow Wilson in 1916. She was called the silver-tongued orator of the suffrage movement in these states. Again, she was effective as a speaker, not necessarily so effective, however, in making the case to vote against Wilson on this one issue alone. And it is Erskine who, more than anybody else, spars with her about this. He supported Wilson's reelection, even though he knew Wilson was not going to do anything to advance the federal amendment. By 1916, as you will recall, Europe is involved in a war, and Woodrow Wilson is promising the electorate that he will keep us out of that war. So for Erskine, that was the most important issue. And he thought that the women should just wait, just put their concerns about the federal amendment aside, because keeping America out of World War I was the most important issue to him. Well, Sarah would have none of that. She said to him, look, if you were the one who was not enfranchised, you wouldn't be saying that. You would insist that enfranchisement be the first issue for you as well. So she begins then, by this time, by 1916, to really have greater confidence in herself and push back and argue with him in these letters about political matters upon which they'd always been in agreement before. But now she was willing to disagree with him and actually to go on at some length about why he was wrong and she was right. In the end, she hoped that Wilson would win, but lose the West. And that didn't happen. In fact, Wilson won the election. He won California, which of all the Western states had the greatest number of women voters in it. So the strategy really didn't work. Wilson was reelected. Soon after Wilson's reelection, the National Women's Party decides to up the ante now. They have to deal with him. He's in the White House, but their way of dealing with him is to do something that was also unheard of at the time, which was to picket the White House. I mean, nobody picketed the White House, let alone respectable middle-class women. But they were doing it and getting a lot of attention for it. By April, when the United States is now going to war. Wilson changed his mind about that, and the country is involved in a war in Europe. Many people felt it was unpatriotic and inappropriate for people, particularly women, or anybody for that matter, but especially these women, to be picketing the president. So they were coming under a lot of fire. In fact, they were being arrested, and many people, of course, know the story of that, being thrown into jail, and some of them being force-fed, and so on and so forth. Alice Paul wanted Sarah to picket and go to jail, but she demurred on the basis of her health. And Alice Paul said to her, well, you know, we could use a martyr here, so how about it? And so Sarah said, oh no, I'm not going to do that. And she secretly wrote to Erskine that she thought if Alice Paul had been a mother, she would not have asked that of Sarah. Instead, she spent the summer in Newport, Rhode Island, ghostwriting Alva Vanderbilt Belmont's autobiography. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was a major underwriter of the National Women's Party. But she continues to spar with Erskine over these newer tactics, which he thought were ill-advised and completely inappropriate. And so they again have very heated discussions about this. And she begins to say things to him like, I am bigger than you. I am bigger than you. And what she meant by that was that she was braver than he was, that she was more committed to justice, that she was willing to sacrifice more for him when it came to these political issues that really mattered. And then beneath the surface, she was also saying to him, I am bigger than you in our relationship. I have given up more. I have waited for you, and still you aren't coming. Well, to make a long story short, it was actually the war that brought resolution to Erskine's long brewing legal case, and the windfall that he needed to finally create trust for his family and leave Portland. So in 1918, he finally did move to San Francisco and begin to live with Sarah. I forget what my next slide is. Let me see. Okay. It looks quite big on my screen. Does it fit everybody else's?
Yes.
Okay. So this was a photograph taken in the late summer of 1918 when he finally came to live with her in California. And it's interesting that from that point on, her involvement in the suffrage movement ended. The suffrage movement had been so important to her for the reasons that I indicated. But once she achieved this life with Wood, that was her real long-term goal, and she had what she wanted. There was a personal tragedy in her life around this time that I won't go into. So they didn't have the euphoric happiness, but they did live together openly in free love fashion. She, unlike Wood, did not advocate or trumpet that arrangement, but neither did she hide it. So to sort of sum up my argument here, her immersion in the suffrage movement in the company of talented and ambitious and independent women.
Someone has their mic on. Yes.
Okay.
We are. Somebody. Yeah, somebody's got their mic on that needs to turn it off, please.
Okay. Anyway, okay, so it was her immersion in the suffrage movement that really refined her aspirations, I think, regarding not only equality as a citizen in the nation, but also equality as a partner in a free love relationship. So it was participation in the more radical branch of the movement itself, which brought her into conflict with Erskine, but also gave her greater confidence to demand and achieve more power in her relationship with him. Initially, she had deferred to his greater sophistication, experience, and wisdom, yet she was really ripe for revolt against male privilege and patriarchy. And she took it on not only in the bigger world, but also in her relationship with him. In her newfound self-assurance and self-possession, which came through the suffrage movement, she challenged him, and she ultimately bent him to a more equitable partnership. So in the next slide, I think I have a photograph of where they lived.
Yes.
They lived initially on a Russian hill, and then they discovered that they had a very active social life, and they turned from politics more to art. But they were inundated with guests who used to love to come to their home on Russian Hill, and they loved having people come, but they were not succeeding in their writing careers. So they decided to move down to this property near Los Gatos, if people know where that is. It's kind of well, it's a little bit south of San Jose or Santa Clara, up against the mountains. And then this is up the mountains that are between Los Gatos and San Jose and Santa Cruz on the ocean. So there's a highway that goes from Santa Clara over to Santa Cruz. And along the highway, people to this day can see these two stone cats. And I can only see the trees on my little phone, but can you see the cats, Marcia?
Yes, the cats are there. Yes, very clearly.
The cats are there. Okay, right. So they were put up by Erskine and Sarah in about 1926 or 27. And the road behind them leads up to the house, which I believe you can also see, both the exterior and the interior. It was the dream house that Erskine had always imagined that they were able to create. And they lived a very beautiful life there for about 20 years or so. They had another little house up the hill where they would write their poetry. They actually were producing poetry. It was getting published, some of it, Sarah's case, in New York, by New York publishers. And then I have a few more pictures of them at the cats in the next slide, where you can see they aged gracefully there, quite happily. And the picture on the upper right was a photograph taken by Ansel Adams. That is Sarah's daughter at the day of her wedding. Sarah's child decided to marry, was not interested in free love. The same is true, by the way, of Erskine's children. They all married. They were not following their dad in the free love footsteps. So there's something of a happy ending to this story, at least for Sarah and Erskine. It was a hard row for those first 8 years or so, but once together, they were able to create the life that they had always dreamed of. Now, I also, in the book, go on at some length about what it meant for the other members of their family. It was not quite such a happy story for them. But I think for now, I will end with just the fact that, making this point one more time, that she helped achieve equality in the voting booth for other women as well as for herself. But she was also very interested in pushing for equality and greater freedom in the home through the lived example that she and Erskine created and through the rich archive of letters that they left to us to read today. So I'll stop with that and hope there might be some comments or questions.
Okay, thank you. That was really great. Jerry is willing to take questions, and I know there were questions before she started about whether she had come to Eugene during her campaigns, and I'm sure that there are other questions as well. And there are two ways you can ask questions. You can do it through the chat. If you've got your screen on, you can raise your hand, actually. Or if you look at the participants list, well, I don't see it, how you do that. So at any rate, you should do it through the chat, I guess, or simply raising your hands or speaking up. So Sherry, since somebody did ask whether Sarah ever came through Eugene in her campaign for suffrage, I'm interested to hear about that, if at all.
Yes, she did. And she was quite proud of herself when she came to Eugene because she was speaking to like 3 different groups in a day. And one of the things that made her such an effective speaker was she really knew who her audience was, and she would tailor her comments to the audience. And so I do remember one letter she wrote to Wood from Eugene. She was pretty humble, actually. She didn't want to toot her own horn too much, but she was very proud of herself, particularly in Eugene, because at one point she was talking to university people, and another point I think she went to a church and so on. So she went all over the state, all of the big cities, but also many of the smaller rural parts of Eastern Oregon. In fact, I think the rural parts of the state were considered to be particularly important for the success of suffrage in Oregon. So she spent a lot of time in the Grange and Baker City and all of those places. But, you know, it's interesting. She once ran into I think it was a professor at the University of Oregon who said to her, do you know Mary Field? And he had been, Mary Field, her sister's professor at the University of Michigan. He was now at the University of Oregon. And he had thought very highly of Mary Field. And he thought that Sarah's style seemed to have been inspired by Mary Field. Well, of course, she was her sister. So she had learned, I think, by watching Mary, who was an incredible person. If there's anybody in the book I like the most, it's actually Mary Field. And she also learned a lot by watching Erskine, who was also well known as an orator. So she had a couple of mentors that she learned from. And she was definitely in Eugene.
Thank you. Are there other questions from people? Yes, Trina, and be sure to unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. Well, really interesting presentation. Thank you so much for sharing it, and I look forward to checking out the book, actually. So you didn't address anything too specific in terms of ostracization or peer pressure that Sarah and Erskine might have gotten. It seems so radical to think back in the early 1900s that they could kind of get away with this lifestyle without a lot of pushback from people.
Yes. Well, Erskine, of course, had great power and confidence in himself. And he's an interesting fellow for many reasons. And one of them is his business, his job, usually required working on behalf of corporations and businessmen and conservative folk of Portland. And somehow he was able to keep them as his clients while in his private life, which was often quite public, writing essays, going to the Arlington Club and talking to these guys about free love and radicalism and anti-imperialism. He had a lot of cachet. He was, as I think anyway, quite attractive. He had presence, he had confidence. And so he was able to wield power and do what he wanted without much in the way of consequences for his business or his life. I mean, there were certainly detractors of Wood, to be sure. There were people who despised him, but they couldn't touch him, really. He was a wealthy white man who could pretty much get away with it. Sarah, of course, as I say, was taking a whole lot more risk here, but the fact of the matter was she did not seem to care. I have never seen love letters like the letters she wrote to Erskine. I mean, she was just over the top. I mean, if I were him, I would have run away from her. She was so crazy about him. I mean, really, she was so deeply in love with him. She was willing to pay anything. And so certainly she came under criticism from the church. Her husband was the minister, for one thing. He lost his job, by the way, not too long after. But she didn't care. And in the meantime, there was a coterie of people, friends of theirs, who were fellow travelers and who were supportive. So in Portland, there were people like Marie Equi, I'm not sure I'm saying her name right, E-Q-U-I, who was an openly gay political figure in Portland who was a friend of theirs, and others who were, I guess all I can say, is supportive of Sarah. And so she managed to do just fine there. And then in the women's suffrage movement, this was really interesting to me to discover that quite a few of the women were living non-traditional sexual lives. I don't know, I didn't see her talk at all about same-sex relationships, although we do know they were not uncommon in the suffrage movement. But a number of her friends were also involved in relationships with married men, free love relationships, that kind of thing. So I guess she found her friendships with people who would support her. And although the bigger world might have disdained her and criticized her, she really didn't seem to care very much.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, that is super interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Sherry, a quick question about her children. I'm not too concerned about his children and accepting him, but what about her children? What was their response to mom, giving up custody?
Yes, that is a very important part of the story that I tell, because they were quite young. I believe her son was maybe 9 and her daughter 5 or something like that when this all began. And they understood that he came first in their mother's heart. And they loved their mother and they loved their father, and they were caught in between. So it is just the sort of classic case of these kids who were really suffering a great deal, frankly, because of this love affair. The boy did want to, he loved his mother very much. I think Sarah thought she and her son were more alike, and the daughter was more like her father. So she seemed to think she had a special relationship with his son and vice versa. So he was a little older as this is unfolding and seemed to be better able to manage a relationship with her and with Wood, who he looked up to. He thought he was just an incredible man. The daughter had a much harder time actually with her mother and with Wood. And that, didn't work because Sarah would not, accept that. So the daughter was really hurt very much by this whole story and carried scars the rest of her life because of it. So the thing that's so incredible to me is that because they were apart from her, there are letters that, that they write to her, and she writes letters to them, although I don't have as many of those. But the kids were just amazingly mature for their age. They had to be. They had to negotiate and live with a father who was totally devastated by what Sarah did. And first he was devastated and was angry, and really angry for a long time. And by the time the son becomes a teenager, those two begin to have real conflict. So the kids are caught in between. It is a story it just breaks my heart, but it is not uncommon, sadly, even today. I do think that now the idea of joint custody is more common, and maybe the trauma is not as terrible as it was 100 years ago. But there is no doubt that those kids knew exactly what was going on and tried their best to maintain a relationship with both parents. It was very, very hard for them.
Thank you.
But thanks for asking, because that's a big part of the story is what it did. And actually, I will just add that although Erskine's children were grown, they were also very devastated by their father leaving Portland and leaving their mother. He was a wonderful father. He was a generous soul. He was the opposite of his own father. He wanted his children to be who they were. He did everything he could to make them happy in their lives. So when he left, it was devastating for them too. And they too felt like they were caught between their father and their mother, but if forced to choose, and particularly Erskine, his oldest son, made it clear that he would choose his mother. And so he often was very angry with his dad for what had happened. So it doesn't matter how old the children are. In a way, I learned that it can still be very hurtful when parents leave.
Again, thank you.
Thanks. Barbara.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Barbara.
Yes, I think the story of what happens to Sarah's son is heartbreaking and worth telling.
Okay. For everybody who is watching, this is my sister who lives in Bend. So she kind of knows the story. When Wood comes down to San Francisco to join Sarah, he first stays over in Corte Madera because Sarah's husband had moved down to the Bay Area too. And he had the children living across the Bay. He lived over in Berkeley. And when he knew that Wood was coming, he made it clear to her that they were never to spend time in Wood's presence. And Sarah just ignored that. In the meantime, Wood had decided that they needed a car, but he didn't want to learn how to drive. He wanted Sarah to learn how to drive this car. I think it was a Chandler. So one beautiful October day, about, it was 1918, probably around October 12th, I think it was, Sarah's children were coming to see her on Russian Hill, and she decided to put them in the car and go visit Wood over in Corte Madera. And although she was just learning to drive, she was, ready to go, and she went, she took them. They took a picnic lunch up into the Marin Headlands, and then she got into a space where she could not negotiate the car, and she had to back up And when she backed up, the car went over the edge of a 30-foot embankment and it rolled over and it ended bottom up. And Albert, her son, was killed. Wood and Sarah and her daughter, Catherine, survived, but her beautiful 17-year-old son, who she loved dearly, was dead. So this was the personal tragedy that I just sort of glossed over in my general comments, but this was just a terrible thing to have happen, of course. And when Reverend Ergot heard about it, he was just, beyond himself. And there were some very, very ugly moments when Catherine, the daughter, witnessed her father telling her mother, "You killed our son." And I mean, the drama and trauma of this is almost unbelievable. If you had written it for a novel, an editor would say, "Get rid of that. That's over the top." But it is, in fact, what happened. And it took Sarah a long time to recover from that, both, first of all, physically, but also emotionally. So when I said they didn't have this euphoric happiness when Wood came, that was part of the reason why. It took a couple of years for them to work through that tragedy.
Other questions or comments?
I had a question going more away from the personal a little and back to the political.
Okay.
I was wondering about this, about the idea of free love and that they're advocating for this. But I mean, it seems obvious that certainly for women that's only going to work if it sort of goes hand in hand with the ability to be financially independent as well, which was, sort of not the model at the time. Was that kind of part of the conversations that they were having at all?
Yes, so I have to tell everybody that this is my sister Barbara's daughter, Brooke, who's also my niece. I did, invite a couple of family members to join us tonight, and Brooke lives in Bellingham, Washington. So thanks, Brooke. She's a professor up at Western Washington. Yeah, Brooke, that's a good question. And it was an issue for her and for them. She kept telling him, "Look, I can get a job and I can support both of us." He had a beautiful home he loved stuff. He wanted things. He liked being wealthy. This was just an absurd notion to him that they would live on her earnings. But she didn't think it was so ridiculous. All she wanted to do was live a simple life with him. And so she had proved to herself that she could actually make a living in politics and in other things as well. So she had confidence that she could do that. And she was willing to give up the rich, wealthy life that he had had in Portland just to be together and work on their poetry in a hovel, if that's the best that they could do. But yes, I mean, to be self-supporting was important to her. She wrote about it a lot, and he would dismiss it. "Why are you even talking about this?" He'd say to her, "Look, you're Mrs. Rockefeller. Don't worry about money. I have the money." And he wasn't I want to make it clear that he was not using money to manipulate her. He was truly a generous soul, but he did want to have money, and he would not leave until he had secured it, not only for his family, but for himself as well. But she would have been willing to do with much less, because she did finally discover that indeed she could make a living for herself. But what she really wanted in life, as I said several times now, was to live with him. And so it involved, in the end, living with him in a very nice house that he paid mostly for. But thanks for the question, Brooke. It's nice to see you.
I remember driving by those cats all the time when I lived in the Bay Area and thinking they were super cool. And now it's like even more cool to know something more about where they came from.
Other questions?
Yes, I remember.
Go ahead, Sherry. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I remember seeing them too before I knew who was responsible for them. I had the great fortune to actually go in and see the place. I have a friend who teaches at UC Santa Cruz in the English department, and she knew I was working on this book. And one day she drove by and she saw a for sale sign outside by the cats. And she said, "You should call the realtor and see if he will let you go see the house." And I thought, and I was living in Dallas. I thought, I don't know if he will, but I called him and he said, sure. So I went out there and I got to actually go into the property and see it. And it was very much as it looked in the photographs that I showed you. Those are photographs that were at the Huntington Library that were made in the mid-50s when Sarah finally sold the estate. So I think maybe there had been 2 owners between 1955 and this was, I think, in 2014. I hope whoever bought it has retained much of the artwork on the property and in the home. On the outside, there's lots of sculptures and things like that on the property. I hope it, I mean, it really is truly a heritage site that is worth preserving, and I hope it found the right owner. I don't know who bought it though.
Josh.
I did tell the realtor the book was out, that I'd be happy to have a book.
You've become unstable, Sherry.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you. Yeah, Josh had a question. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Marcia, and thank you, Professor, for a great talk. I missed a little bit of it, so forgive me if you might have covered this, but I have studied the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, and the timing of this, of the story you're telling, and I know you have obviously expertise in Western history as well, but with the labor movement, with the radicalism, with Joe Hill in Utah, which is what I've studied more, and Portland and kind of the West Coast down in California, being an IWW hotbed in the teens, I'm just wondering if they had any interactions or not with them. And again, forgive me if you had said something before, I missed part of this at the beginning.
Thanks for the question. No, I didn't talk about that part of their political activities. And the answer is yes, absolutely. They were very supportive of the IWW, Erskine in particular. He did not approve of the use of violence, but he did believe that workers deserved to, to organize, and he was very supportive of them, short of any use of violence. Excuse me. The famous Everett massacre was one of the most abhorrent things to happen to the IWW, and so he was asked to help with the legal case, and he did go to court, but for the most part he was very much in favor of all labor organizations and the IWW, but he did not sanction the use of violence.
Thanks, Sherry. Other questions or comments? Bob.
Sherry, are you familiar with a story about one of, I believe, Erskine's sons who went to live for a summer or more with the Nez Perce, and there was an arrangement having to do with a horse, and the horse actually doesn't get transferred until several generations later? Are you familiar with that story?
I am a little bit. I know more about Erskine sending his son, whose name was also Erskine, to live with Joseph than I don't have a lot of personal knowledge about the later horse exchange, although I know it happened. But I do think it's a lovely story that Erskine's father insisted that he go to West Point, and when he became a father himself, when CES becomes a father himself, he sends his son not to West Point, but to live with Joseph for a couple of months in a couple of different years, when he was like 13 or 14. And that's what, one of the lovely parts of the book, but also sad parts of the book, is the breakdown of the relationship between father and son over Sarah and this love affair, because they shared so much. The younger Erskine becomes a lawyer. He's part of the law firm. They love the brilliant skies and the outdoors of the Harney Desert. They love to fish. And the son was always grateful to his father for giving him that time with Chief Joseph. So, oops. I think I'm about to lose my battery on my phone, but yes, it is. It's a very lovely, lovely story.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments before Sherry loses her battery power?
I tell you.
Sherry, could you just give us like the 1 paragraph version of what happens after Erskine dies, if that's not giving away too much of the book?
Oh, no, actually, I had a lot more about after Erskine died, but the editor said that's not nearly as interesting. So I had to cut a bunch of it out. But he died in 1944 at age 91. So he did have a full, lovely life. And Sarah spent another 10 years at the Cats. And among the things she did was she helped to get published the collected works, the collected poems of Charles Erskine Scott Wood. And she tried really hard to find somebody to write his biography. It was not so successful. Some of you may know Edwin Bingham, who was a history professor at the University of Oregon, who intended to write that biography, but never quite got around to it. But eventually another man named Robert Hamburger did publish it later, but long after Sarah died. So she sold the house in the mid-50s and went over to the East Bay where her daughter lived. She was married to a University of California, Berkeley English professor. And she lived the best life she could. But the fact of the matter was that life without Erskine was a much diminished life for her. So she tried to keep herself busy. She did enjoy her family, but her life was just not the same without this incredible partner that she had devoted her life to. So now the thing about biographies that I always do not like is they always end with people dying. You know, they always end in a very sad way. And when Erskine died, of course, she wrote beautiful obituary for him. Many people wrote obituaries for Erskine Wood. When Sarah died, the only one I could find was a really short one in the Oakland paper, which mentioned her involvement as a suffragist and called her the wife of Charles Erskine Scott Wood. And it didn't say much about her, and it just struck me as so insufficient because she had had such an incredibly interesting and important life as well. So I think I'm the first person to write at such length about Sarah Bartfield, and I hope that I'm at least giving her some of the attention that I think she deserved as well. There were times when I don't like her, times when I did not like Erskine. They made choices that I didn't always like, but I do admire them for trying to create the life that they wanted to live. And I think there's something admirable, at least in that. So again, great question. Thanks for asking.
Bob.
One more.
Okay.
Erskine died in the midst of another war. Did they oppose the United States involvement in World War II?
They did not, and that was because of fascism and Hitler. It was hard for them to take that stand, but they felt that they had no choice. And the other interesting thing about World War II, if I can just add this very last thing, is that Erskine was very interested in Asian arts and antiques, and he had become good friends with a Japanese man who had a shop in San Francisco. And not long after Pearl Harbor, that man and his entire family were incarcerated in a camp. And so the family asked for his help, and he wrote letters on their behalf. But they pretty much spent most of the war in the camp. The kids eventually were allowed to go work in the Midwest, but the father remained in the camp almost until the end of the war and died not long after. But here again, at the end of his life, he stands up for what he believes is right, and he's horrified at the incarceration of Japanese American people. So that's the Erskine that we admire, right?
Anyone else?
Yeah, I have one more question.
Go ahead, Barbara.
It just occurs to me that almost the reverse.
You've frozen.
CE.
Yep.
He was the
Marcia, you seem frozen. Barbara, I think you're frozen.
Yeah, I'm not. I was still, but I think Barbara is frozen.
Do you want to try one more time, Barbara?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Let's see. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Barbara. We can hear you now. Go ahead.
It occurs to me that the courtship is reversed with Nanny and C.E.S. Wood with his first wife, that he was the quote unquote lesser of the two. It was long and involved, and he was considered, you know, sort of not worthy of her. And you said their marriage was unhappy. And why had that happened then over the years?
I missed the word, their marriage was unhappy. Is that what you said?
Yeah, you said that earlier.
Their marriage was
When
unhappy by the time he was in his 50s. Initially, they had a very happy marriage. He was totally smitten with her. And you're right, his Nanny's stepfather did not think that Erskine was the right person for her for a couple of reasons. He didn't think a military life in the West would be the best for his stepdaughter, and also Erskine was not Catholic. And of course, some of his animosity toward the Catholic Church and its involvement in marriage and children and so forth comes from the fact that he was very much opposed to the dictum that they would have to raise their children in the Catholic Church, and he totally refused to do that. So anyway, yes, he certainly pursued Nanny, and he loved her, and they had a delightful relationship for many years. But by middle age, he had become a different man. He had changed in ways that she had not. He drifted apart for a number of reasons, and so by the 1900s, he was unhappily married and could not extricate himself from the marriage. But I mean, he did love her. He loved her as a person. He loved her as the mother of his children. He did not want to hurt her. But he did hurt her because he was determined to be who he truly was. And that was somebody other than the man she had originally married.
I guess I find it interesting that you say that they continued to correspond with their spouses and with each other's spouses. What was that about? That seems...
Yeah, well, yeah. Wood, he had this whole speech that he would give about free love. And he would give it to anybody who would listen, or anybody who didn't want to listen, but was involved in that triangle. So he wrote letters to, he was actually friends with Reverend Ergot, actually, until Ergot discovered what was going on. But they exchanged letters, and they're incredible letters. It's like a man of the cloth speaking about the necessity of religious vows, living up to those vows. He believed very much that God was going to punish Erskine. And Erskine is a man who saw himself as a man of science in the modern world and all of this. And they exchanged letters with each other. They're really remarkable letters about how they felt. And they were making a case for each other, hoping in the process, I guess, to convince Sarah of one thing or the other. Sarah had already gone over to the dark side from Ergot's point of view and was not going to come back. But yes, I do not have letters from Erskine's wife about the affair. There are some that she wrote him once he moved to California, where she stayed away from the pain and the loneliness that she felt, and instead talked about their children and the grandchildren. But there are indications that Ergot wrote to Nanny Wood, which just horrified everybody. So yeah, I mean, but Wood and Ergot go at each other in these letters that are quite revealing and interesting. And I had to cut back on those too. The editor said, okay, we get it already. We understand their positions, but they were quite forceful and determined to win, not only Sarah, but to win the battle of the minds as well. So they had a lot in common in some respects. They both were fiercely certain they were right in their position.
Interesting. Okay, any other questions? Was Lucy wanting to get in at one point, or someone?
Excuse me, I have a mouthful of food. No, I was going to ask that exact question, what the letters between the spouses and the various parties were. She answered that very well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I should say about Ergot's letters to Sarah become increasingly angry as time goes on. And she really was, of course, suffering a great deal of guilt for having left him. And so she would not necessarily respond in kind. But finally, once Erskine came down to California before Albert died, she did really say, enough already, enough. I'm never coming back to you, and I'm really tired of your abuse, and stop. So she finally stood up to him as well. And I think this is another example of how working in the suffrage movement helped her find her voice and her power, and to push back not only with Erskine, but also with Ergot. But they're just incredible letters, I have to say. If you're interested, you should go down to Huntington and look at some of them. This is why I got caught up in this story, because these people just let it all hang out. I mean, they just really reveal a lot about themselves. And sometimes they lie, and I know when they're doing that too. But they're trying very hard to explain themselves to each other and to excuse themselves to each other as well.
Other questions or comments? Okay, if there's no, oh, I'm sorry, Bob.
I just was going to say nothing on chat. Perhaps you ought to announce the next program.
Yes, the next, you know the date probably. It's the second Monday, whatever that is. Is that the 14th? Do you know?
I'm looking it up. Second Monday, the 9th.
The 9th. And you know more about the speaker, so why don't you talk about who the speaker is going to be?
Okay, Mark Harris, a retired drug counselor, local historian extraordinaire of African-American activity in Eugene over the years, is going to talk about African-American history in Eugene, which certainly for a topic relevant to the current social ferment is something I think you're all going to want to hear. I think you'll all be surprised. Very good public speaker and quite fervent and quite convincing.
Great. So we hope that you all will join us to hear Mark Harris talk next month, and same time. And we'll try to bring our prop of the Viking Braggot beer so that you can see the black can that it comes in. But at any rate, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you very much, Sherry, for coming and presenting what sounds like a fascinating book. She has sent me a PDF file of the book that I have not had a chance to read yet, but I'd like to buy the book because I think it's going to be really lovely to read. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you very much, Sherry.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And we'll,
Thanks.
you have one last word, Sherry?
I just want to say thanks for putting up with all the technical difficulties, but we made it. So thanks. Thanks again, Marcia, for having me.
That's Zoom for us. At any rate, thanks very much. And we will see you all in a month, I hope. I've got one. I see a chat from someone. Oh, just thank you. So thank you so much, everyone. And we will see you next month, same time, same place. So check on the museum website or the history website for details, or the Eugene Weekly. So thanks so much, and we will see you next month.
It's a fabulous book.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I look forward to reading it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Marcia, other than technical difficulties, I think we did fine.
I think so too.